In the twilight hours when the modern world grows quiet and your mind seeks the gentle embrace of sleep, let me carry you back across the centuries to a land shrouded in mist and mystery. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, we shall embark together on a journey through nearly 1,000 years of English history, a tale so rich and vast that it will cradle your consciousness like the soft medieval tapestry woven from threads of gold and silver. This is not merely the story of kings and battles, though we shall witness both in abundance. This is the epic of how a collection of warring tribes became a unified nation, how that nation survived the fury of Viking longships and Norman cavalry, how it slowly, inevitably transformed into something unprecedented in human history. We shall walk through the smoke-blackened halls where Saxon warriors feasted by firelight, stand beneath the soaring stone arches of Gothic cathedrals that still inspire awe today, and witness the birth of institutions that would eventually spread across the globe. The threads of this narrative stretch from the desperate final days of Roman Britain to the dawn of the Tudor age, from the monastery scriptorium where monks preserved ancient wisdom by candlelight to the parliamentary halls where the foundations of modern democracy were laid stone by stone. We shall meet remarkable individuals whose names still echo through history. Alfred the Great, who saved England from dissolution; William the Conqueror, who reshaped a kingdom through force of will; Thomas Becket, whose martyrdom shocked medieval Europe; and countless others who built, defended, and transformed the England we know today. But before we can understand the magnificent civilization that emerged, we must first witness the darkness from which it grew. Picture, if you will, the year 410 AD, when the last Roman legions marched away from British shores, leaving behind not just empty fortresses and abandoned roads, but a vacuum that would reshape the very soul of a nation. What followed would become one of history's most extraordinary transformations. And tonight, as sleep carries you gently away, let this ancient story unfold around you like the warmest of blankets, guarding your dreams with tales of courage, wisdom, and the eternal human quest to build something greater than ourselves. As the 5th century dawned across the mist-covered hills and valleys of what we now call England, the greatest empire the world had ever known was beginning its slow retreat from the edges of civilization. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman eagles had cast their shadows across British soil, bringing with them the gifts of law, engineering, and urban culture that had transformed a collection of Celtic tribes into a prosperous provincial society. But empires, like the seasons, must eventually change, and the pressures mounting against Rome's distant frontiers had grown too great to ignore. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine, Hunnic horsemen threatened the Danube, and the Eternal City itself faced challenges that demanded every available legion. When the recall came in 410 AD, it arrived not as a temporary measure, but as a final farewell that would echo through the centuries. The Romano-British population that watched those disciplined columns disappear beyond the horizon faced a choice that would define the next millennium of their history. Some, clinging to the fading memories of imperial order, attempted to maintain the Roman way of life in their hilltop towns and villa estates. Others, recognizing that the world had fundamentally changed, began to adapt to new realities, new customs, new ways of understanding their place in an uncertain universe. But across the gray waters of the North Sea, where storm clouds gathered like omens above restless waves, other peoples were preparing for journeys that would change everything. The Angles, dwelling in what we now call Denmark, felt the pressure of population growth and climatic change pushing them toward desperate solutions. The Saxons, fierce warriors from the forests of northwestern Germany, dreamed of fertile lands where their children might prosper. The Jutes, inhabiting the misty peninsulas of modern Denmark, heard tales of a rich island across the waters where Roman order was crumbling and opportunity awaited those bold enough to seize it. What followed was not a single invasion, but a centuries-long migration that would gradually, inexorably transform the British landscape. These newcomers came not as a unified army under imperial banners, but as individual war bands, each following their own lord, each seeking their own portion of this promised land that lay beyond the setting sun. The first Anglo-Saxon warriors to beach their shallow-drafted ships on English shores brought with them more than weapons and ambition. They carried their gods, their laws, their languages, and their dreams of establishing kingdoms that would endure for generations yet unborn. Woden the Wanderer, Thunor the Thunder-bearer, Tio the one-handed god of war, Frigg, the goddess of love and fertility, these deities who gave their names to our days of the week represented a worldview as different from Roman Christianity as the wolf differs from the sheep.
In their great halls, lit by roaring fires that cast dancing shadows on carved pillars and painted walls, these early Anglo-Saxon lords gathered their warrior companions around them in bonds of loyalty that transcended mere political allegiance. Here the scop, the court poet, would recite tales of heroes and monsters, of brave deeds performed in distant lands, of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that would one day end when the gods themselves fell at Ragnarok. When they sang of Beowulf's battle against the monster Grendel, when they celebrated the dragon slayer's final victory and tragic death, they were not merely entertaining themselves through the long winter nights. They were defining what it meant to be a hero in their world, establishing the values that would guide their society for centuries to come. Courage in the face of overwhelming odds, loyalty to one's lord and companions, generosity to those who served faithfully, and the acceptance of fate with dignity and honor. These became the pillars upon which Anglo-Saxon civilization would rise. The Romano-British population faced this Germanic tide with responses as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. Some fled westward to the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the flickering flame of Roman civilization and Christian faith. These refugees would preserve in their monastery libraries and bardic traditions the memory of what Britain had been, keeping alive the hope that someday the old order might return. Others chose to remain, gradually adapting to new masters, new customs, new languages that would eventually blend with their own to create something unprecedented. They learned to serve Saxon lords, to work Saxon lands, to live according to Saxon laws, but in the process they also influenced their conquerors, softening harsh Germanic customs with Romano-British sophistication, introducing their new rulers to the possibilities of organized agriculture, planned settlements, and administrative efficiency. Still others took up arms in desperate attempts to preserve what they had known and loved. It was during this tumultuous period that the figure we know as Arthur may have emerged, not as the shining knight of later romance, mounted on a white charger and bearing Christian symbols, but as a Romano-British war leader, desperately rallying his people against the advancing tide of Saxon settlement. Whether Arthur existed as a single historical individual or represents the collective memory of many such leaders, the legend that grew around his name speaks to something profound about this moment in British history. The stories of Camelot, of knights seeking the Holy Grail, of a once and future king who would return in Britain's darkest hour, all reflect the deep longing of a displaced people for a golden age when justice prevailed and heroes walked the earth. The Saxon kingdoms that eventually emerged from this chaos of migration and settlement were unlike anything Britain had known before. These were not the sophisticated administrative units of Roman rule, governed by appointed officials, answerable to distant emperors, but intensely personal kingdoms, based on the sacred bond between lord and warrior, between protector and protected.
The king was not a distant figure residing in a marble palace surrounded by bureaucrats and courtiers, but a war leader who must prove his worth in battle, who must reward his followers with gold rings and broad acres, who must embody in his own person the virtues his people held most dear. When Beowulf declares that a good king must be a giver of rings, a keeper of treasure hoards, a protector of his people, he was describing not just literary ideals, but the practical realities of Anglo-Saxon kingship. As the 6th century progressed and these Germanic kingdoms established themselves across the English landscape, as their wooden halls grew into permanent settlements and their war bands evolved into royal courts, another force was preparing to transform them utterly. In the monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, Christian monks had preserved not only the Gospels, but much of the learning of the ancient world, developing a distinctive form of Christianity that emphasized personal devotion, scholarly pursuit, and missionary zeal. Soon, these Celtic missionaries would begin their journey southward, carrying with them a revolutionary message that would reshape Anglo-Saxon England far more profoundly than any military conquest ever could. The conversion that followed would not simply replace one set of beliefs with another, but would create a new synthesis of Germanic warrior culture and Christian civilization that would define medieval England for centuries to come. Into this landscape of wooden halls and warrior kings, where the old gods still held sway over human hearts, and the smoke of sacrificial fires still rose from sacred groves, came bearers of a message that would transform everything. The year was 597 A.D., when Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, landed on the shores of Kent with a small band of monks carrying nothing more than their faith, their books, and their unshakable conviction that they could convert an entire kingdom to Christ. King Ethelbert of Kent, perhaps influenced by his Frankish Christian wife Bertha, proved receptive to Augustine's message in ways that would echo through the centuries. The baptism of this Anglo-Saxon king marked not just a personal conversion, but the beginning of a transformation that would gradually reshape the entire spiritual and intellectual landscape of England. Yet this was not to be a simple matter of replacing pagan shrines with Christian churches, but a complex process of cultural negotiation and synthesis that would take generations to complete. The Celtic missionaries arriving from the north brought their own distinctive vision of Christian life, one shaped by centuries of isolation in Irish monasteries where learning had been preserved through the darkest years following Rome's collapse. When St. Columba established his monastery on the island of Iona, when St. Aidan came south to found Lindisfarne, they carried with them not just the gospel message, but a tradition of scholarship, artistic achievement, and spiritual devotion that would soon rival anything found in continental Europe. The meeting of these two Christian traditions, Roman and Celtic, would create one of the most significant religious and cultural moments in English history. The Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, where representatives of both churches gathered to resolve differences in practice and doctrine, might seem to modern ears like a debate over trivial matters: the proper date for celebrating Easter, the correct form of monastic tonsure, the authority of Rome versus local tradition. But these seemingly minor issues reflected deeper questions about authority, unity, and the nature of Christian civilization itself. King Oswy of Northumbria's decision to follow Roman rather than Celtic practices would link the emerging English Church more closely to continental Europe, bring English monasteries into contact with the scholarly traditions preserved in Rome and Gaul, and establish patterns of ecclesiastical organization that would endure for centuries.
The great monasteries of Northumbria that flourished in the decades following Whitby, Wearmouth, Jarrow, Ripon, York, became centers of learning that rivaled any in Europe. Here, in scriptorium illuminated by candle and lamplight, monks created some of the greatest treasures of early medieval culture. The Lindisfarne Gospels, with their intricate interlace patterns that seem to dance across the parchment in spirals of gold and azure, represent the perfect fusion of Celtic artistic traditions with Christian devotion. In these same monastery libraries, scholars like the Venerable Bede were producing works that would shape European thought for centuries. When Bede completed his ecclesiastical history of the English people in 731 AD, he was doing more than simply recording the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. He was creating a sense of English identity that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms, establishing the idea that these various Germanic tribes had become a single people, united by their common faith and shared history. Monasteries were not isolated communities of prayer and contemplation, but active participants in the economic and social life of their regions. They controlled vast estates worked by hundreds of peasants, managed complex agricultural operations that fed not just their own communities but the surrounding population, and provided essential services that bound them intimately to secular society. Monks served as teachers, physicians, engineers, and diplomats, carrying their learning far beyond monastery walls. The scriptorium of a great monastery like Jarrow was a center of international communication, where letters arrived from Rome, Constantinople, and the courts of continental kings. Here, monks copied not just religious texts, but works of classical literature, historical chronicles, and scientific treatises, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. When Charlemagne sought scholars to staff his palace school, he looked to England, recognizing that the Anglo-Saxon Church had become one of Europe's great centers of learning.
The missionary activity that flowed from these English monasteries would eventually carry Anglo-Saxon influence throughout northern Europe. Willibrord preached to the Frisians, Boniface converted the Germans, and countless lesser-known English missionaries carried the gospel to lands where Roman legions had never marched. The irony was profound. A people who had themselves been converted less than a century earlier were now bringing Christianity to their Germanic cousins across the North Sea. As the 8th century progressed, Anglo-Saxon England had achieved a remarkable synthesis of warrior culture and Christian civilization that would define the golden age of early medieval Europe. The great kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent had developed sophisticated governmental structures that combined traditional Germanic kingship with Christian concepts of divine authority and moral responsibility. The law codes promulgated by kings like Ine of Wessex and Offa of Mercia represented attempts to apply Christian principles to the practical problems of governing warrior societies. These laws sought to protect the weak from the strong, to limit violence through the payment of compensation rather than blood feuds, and to establish the church as a sanctuary for those seeking justice. The famous Mercian king Offa, whose dike still marks the border between England and Wales, issued a coinage so sophisticated that it was accepted throughout northern Europe. The artistic achievements of this period reflected the confidence and cultural sophistication that had emerged from the fusion of Germanic and Christian traditions. The beautiful manuscripts produced in monasteries like Canterbury and Winchester, the intricate metalwork found in treasures like those from Sutton Hoo, the stone crosses that began to appear in churchyards throughout the kingdom, all demonstrated that England had become a major center of European culture. Trade networks extended from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, carrying English products, wool, silver, manuscripts, and missionaries to distant markets, while bringing back silk, spices, and exotic luxuries that testified to England's growing wealth and influence. The Port of London had become one of Northern Europe's great commercial centers, its wharves crowded with ships from across the known world.
Yet even as this golden age reached its zenith, dark clouds were gathering on the northern horizon. In the fjords of Norway and the islands of Denmark, another generation of warriors was preparing for expeditions that would test everything Anglo-Saxon England had achieved. These new raiders possessed ships capable of crossing vast distances, warriors trained from childhood in the arts of war, and a culture that celebrated individual achievement above all other values. The attack on Lindisfarne on June 8, 793 A.D. would shatter the peace of English Golden Age like a thunderbolt splitting a summer sky. But that is a story for our next chapter, as we continue our gentle journey through the mists of medieval time, where even the darkest moments would eventually give birth to new forms of greatness, and where the human spirit would once again prove capable of rising from the ashes of destruction to build something even more magnificent than what had been lost. Sleep comes now softly as we pause at this moment of golden achievement, when England had first found its voice among the nations of Europe, when its monasteries glowed with learning, and its kingdoms prospered in peace. The trials ahead would test this civilization to its very foundations, but they would also reveal strengths that even its builders had not suspected lay hidden in the hearts of the English people. From the morning mists that shrouded the North Sea on that fateful June day in 793 A.D., dragon-proud ships emerged like harbingers of a new age of terror. the holy island of Lindisfarne, that jewel of Northumbrian Christianity, where monks had labored for generations to preserve the light of learning, lay peaceful and defenseless beneath the summer sky. The brothers who tended their gardens and copied their manuscripts in the scriptorium had no warning of what approached across the gray waters, no conception that their world was about to change forever. The Vikings who struck Lindisfarne with such devastating suddenness were not mere barbarians seeking random destruction, though that is how the terrified chroniclers would remember them. These were calculated predators who understood exactly what they were doing, warriors who had studied their targets and chosen their moment with ruthless precision. They knew that monasteries contained the greatest concentrations of portable wealth in Anglo-Saxon society. Golden altar vessels, silver reliquaries, silk vestments, and illuminated manuscripts whose covers gleamed with precious gems. More importantly, they understood the psychological impact their attack would have on Christian England. By desecrating the most sacred sites, by spilling the blood of defenseless monks on consecrated ground, by carrying away the treasures that represented centuries of devotion and sacrifice, they were not just enriching themselves, but striking terror into the hearts of their enemies. The message was unmistakable. Nowhere was safe, nothing was sacred, and the old certainties that had governed Anglo-Saxon life were crumbling like parchment in flames. The monk Alcuin, riding from Charlemagne's court, captured the horror that swept through educated Europe when news of Lindisfarne's destruction arrived. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The attack seemed to herald the end times themselves, a divine punishment for sins that must have been terrible indeed to warrant such devastation. But the raid on Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Viking longships appeared with increasing frequency along English coasts, their shallow drafts allowing them to penetrate far inland via rivers that had once been highways of peaceful commerce. The Thames, the Humber, the Severn, all became avenues of Viking penetration, carrying terror to communities that had never expected to face seaborne raiders. These early Vikings perfected the art of the lightning strike, appearing suddenly from the sea, overwhelming local defenses through speed and surprise, seizing treasure and captives, and vanishing again before organized resistance could be mounted. Their ships, marvels of medieval engineering, could be carried across portages between river systems, allowing them to appear where no enemy was expected. Towns that had prospered for centuries found themselves suddenly vulnerable, their wealth transformed from blessing to curse. As the 9th century progressed, the nature of Viking activity began to evolve in ways that would prove even more dangerous to Anglo-Saxon England. What had started as seasonal raiding expeditions undertaken by individual adventurers gradually transformed into systematic campaigns of conquest led by kings and princes who sought not just treasure, but territory. The great heathen army that landed in East Anglia in 865 AD was unlike anything England had faced since the original Anglo-Saxon invasions 4 centuries earlier. Led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Hubba, this force numbered perhaps 3,000 warriors, a vast host by medieval standards, equipped not just for raiding, but for permanent conquest. Their methodology was as systematic as it was ruthless. They would establish a fortified base, extract tribute and supplies from the surrounding region, then move on to the next target, leaving behind garrisons to hold what they had taken. Kingdom after kingdom fell to their advance. East Anglia, whose King Edmund was captured and martyred when he refused to renounce his Christian faith. Northumbria, whose nobility fled or submitted rather than face the Viking axes. Mercia, whose king was reduced to a Viking puppet governing a fragment of his former realm. By 871 AD, only Wessex remained independent, and even that southmost kingdom seemed unlikely to survive the Viking tide. The young prince who inherited the West Saxon throne that year faced what appeared to be an impossible situation. Alfred, youngest son of King Athelwulf, came to power in a kingdom bleeding from countless wounds, its armies demoralized, its resources exhausted, its people beginning to accept that defeat was inevitable. Yet Alfred possessed something that his predecessors had lacked, a vision that extended far beyond mere survival. He understood that the Vikings represented not simply a military challenge, but a fundamental threat to the entire structure of Anglo-Saxon civilization. Their success lay not just in their tactical superiority, but in their ability to exploit the political fragmentation that had long characterized English kingdoms. The crisis that would test Alfred's resolve to its limits came in the winter of 878 AD. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating the feast of Twelfth Night with his court. The assault was so sudden and overwhelming that the king barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the Somerset marshes with only a handful of loyal followers. For weeks that must have felt like years, the future of England hung in the balance as Alfred hid in the wilderness, reduced to little more than a fugitive in his own kingdom. The famous story of the burnt cakes, whether historically accurate or not, captures something essential about this period of testing. The king who would save England found himself in circumstances so humble that he could be scolded by a peasant woman who did not recognize him.
But from this nadir, Alfred began to weave the threads of recovery with a skill that revealed his true genius. Using the ancient system of beacons and messengers, he sent word throughout Wessex that the king still lived, that resistance was still possible, that the Viking victory was not yet complete. The response was remarkable, demonstrating that the bonds between king and people were stronger than the Vikings had imagined. From villages and farms, from the halls of minor nobles and the hovels of common soldiers, men began to gather at the appointed place. They came not because they were compelled by feudal obligation, but because they believed in something larger than themselves, in their king, in their kingdom, in their way of life that was worth preserving against all odds. The Battle of Edington in May 878 was more than a military engagement. It was a moment of national awakening. Alfred's forces, outnumbered and fighting with the desperation of men defending their homes and families, met Guthrum's Vikings in a clash that would determine the fate of England. When the Viking shield wall finally broke under the sustained assault of West Saxon axes and spears, it was not just an army that fled the field, but the myth of Viking invincibility itself. The psychological impact of Edington rippled across England like waves from a stone cast into still water. For the first time since the great army had landed, the Vikings had been not just defeated, but utterly routed by English forces. The news spread quickly, carried by travelers and traders to every corner of the kingdom, giving hope to those who had begun to despair and inspiring new resistance to Viking rule. But Alfred's true genius revealed itself in the aftermath of victory. Rather than simply driving the defeated Vikings from his kingdom, he chose a path that would reshape the entire future of England. The Treaty of Wedmore that he negotiated with captured Guthrum was more than a peace agreement. It was a masterpiece of political imagination that would transform both English and Viking societies. The treaty established formal boundaries between English and Viking territories, creating what would become known as the Danelaw. More significantly,
It required Guthrum to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred himself serving as godfather to his former enemy. This act of political theater carried profound implications that would extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of the peace. By converting the Viking leader, Alfred was beginning a process of cultural integration that would eventually transform both peoples. The Danelaw would remain politically independent, but it would gradually absorb English customs, laws, and religious practices, while the English kingdoms would benefit from Viking innovations in trade, urban development, and military organization.
Alfred's reforms extended far beyond military and diplomatic matters. He recognized that lasting victory required rebuilding the intellectual and spiritual foundations of English society that the Vikings had so systematically destroyed. The great monasteries had been burned, their libraries scattered, their schools closed. The learning that had made 8th century England a beacon of European civilization lay in ruins. The king embarked on an ambitious program of educational renewal, personally translating key works from Latin into English and establishing schools where young nobles could learn to read and write in their own language. His translation of Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, distributed to every bishopric in England, was accompanied by a preface that revealed his understanding of education's crucial role in national recovery. The creation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle stands as perhaps Alfred's greatest cultural achievement. This year-by-year record of English history, written in the vernacular rather than Latin, served multiple purposes that extended far beyond simple record-keeping. It preserved the memory of past events, provided a model for future chroniclers, and most importantly, created a sense of shared English identity that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms. For the first time, people could read about their own history in their own language, connecting themselves to a narrative that stretched back to the arrival of the first Anglo-Saxon settlers. The Chronicle would continue to be maintained for centuries after Alfred's death, becoming one of the most important sources for understanding medieval English history and consciousness. Alfred's legal reforms were equally revolutionary, demonstrating his understanding that a unified kingdom required a unified system of law and justice. His law code, which drew upon the traditions of all the English kingdoms, created a legal framework that could govern a diverse population while preserving the best elements of Anglo-Saxon custom and Christian morality. The transformation of military organization under Alfred created the foundation for all future English success against Viking attacks. The old system of seasonal levies, where farmers abandoned their fields to fight for a few weeks each year, had proven hopelessly inadequate against professional Viking armies. Alfred divided his forces into rotating groups, ensuring that his kingdom could maintain both military readiness and economic productivity.
Even more innovative was his creation of the burh system, fortified towns that could serve as refuges for the local population and bases for military operations. These burhs were more than military installations. They were engines of social and economic transformation, designed to support permanent populations of craftsmen, traders, and administrators. Each burh was planned with streets laid out in regular patterns, plots assigned for houses and workshops, and markets established under royal protection. As Alfred's reign progressed and his reforms took effect, their success became evident in ways that extended
far beyond military victories. The burrs attracted merchants from across Europe, fostering the growth of a money economy that would gradually replace the old system of barter and tribute. The educational reforms produced a new generation of literate administrators capable of managing an increasingly complex government. Most importantly, the king's example of resistance and recovery inspired his people with a confidence that would sustain them through future challenges. When Alfred died in 899 AD, he left behind more than a kingdom. He had created the foundation for a unified English nation that would eventually absorb the Danelaw and establish itself as one of Europe's great powers. His successors would build upon these foundations, but they would never forget that their achievements rested upon the bedrock that one extraordinary king had laid during England's darkest hour.
The children of Alfred the Great inherited more than a kingdom. They received a vision of what England might become and the tools necessary to make that vision reality. Edward the Elder, who succeeded his father in 899 AD, possessed the methodical determination that would prove essential for the long campaign of reconquest that lay ahead. Where Alfred had saved Wessex through desperate heroism, Edward would reclaim England through patient, systematic warfare that combined military innovation with administrative genius. The task before Edward seemed almost impossible. The Danelaw stretched across much of northern and eastern England, controlled by Viking jarls who had ruled their territories for decades and had no intention of submitting to West Saxon authority. These were not the raiders of Alfred's time, but settled rulers who had established their own courts, their own laws, their own identities as English lords. They had married into local families, built churches, and created hybrid societies that blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions in complex ways. Yet Edward possessed advantages that previous English kings had lacked. The burr system that his father had created provided secure bases from which to launch campaigns, while the reformed military organization ensured that he could maintain armies in the field for extended periods. Most importantly, the educational and legal reforms of Alfred's reign had created a sense of English identity that transcended regional boundaries and made the idea of unification not just possible, but inevitable. The reconquest began in earnest around 910 AD, when Edward and his remarkable sister Aethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, launched coordinated campaigns that would gradually push Viking power back toward the sea. Aethelflaed, ruling Mercia as regent for her young son, proved herself one of the most capable military commanders of the age, fortifying towns, building new burhs, and leading armies with a skill that earned the respect of both English and Viking opponents. The strategy they employed was as innovative as it was effective. Rather than seeking decisive battles that might result in catastrophic defeat, they advanced methodically, building fortifications, securing their rear areas, and forcing the Vikings to choose between submission and a fighting retreat that grew more desperate with each passing year. When they did fight, it was on terms of their own choosing, using the tactical innovations that Alfred had pioneered to maximum advantage. The Battle of Tettenhall in 910 AD demonstrated the effectiveness of these new methods. When a Viking army from York attempted to raid Mercia, they found themselves trapped between Edward's forces advancing from the south and Aethelflaed's army moving from the west. The slaughter that followed was so complete that Viking power in the Midlands never recovered, opening the way for the systematic reconquest of all the lands between Wessex and the Humber. By 918 AD, when Athelflaed died at the height of her success, the Danelaw had been reduced to York and its immediate surroundings. Edward, now ruling both Wessex and Mercia, had created something unprecedented in English history: a unified kingdom that stretched from the English Channel to the Scottish borders. The title, King of the Anglo-Saxons, that he adopted reflected this new reality, proclaiming to all who heard it that the age of separate kingdoms was ending. The crown that passed to Edward's son Athelstan in 924 AD carried with it responsibilities and opportunities that no previous English king had enjoyed. Athelstan inherited a unified realm, but he also faced enemies who recognized that English unification posed an existential threat to their own independence. The Scottish kings, the Welsh princes, and the remaining Vikings of York all understood that a unified England would eventually seek to extend its authority beyond its current borders. Athelstan's response to these challenges revealed the military and diplomatic genius that would make him one of medieval Europe's most successful rulers. His conquest of York in 927 AD eliminated the last independent Viking kingdom in England, but rather than simply destroying Viking society, he followed Alfred's example by integrating willing Vikings into his administration, while expelling only the most intractable opponents. The court that Athelstan established was consciously cosmopolitan, attracting scholars, artists, and diplomats from across Europe. He married his sisters to the kings of France and the Holy Roman Empire, establishing English dynasties on the continent that would influence European politics for generations. The manuscripts produced in his scriptoriums, the coins minted in his workshops, the laws promulgated in his assemblies, all proclaimed that England had become a major European power. But the true test of Athelstan's achievement came in 937 AD, when a coalition of enemies gathered to destroy English unification before it could become permanent. The alliance that faced the English army at Brunanburh included Constantine of Scotland, Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, and Owen of Strathclyde, supported by Viking forces from Ireland and the Isle of Man. This was more than a military campaign. It was a struggle for the future character of the British Isles.
The Battle of Brunanburh, fought somewhere in northern England, became one of the bloodiest encounters in early medieval history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, normally restrained in its descriptions of warfare, broke into verse to describe the carnage. Never yet in this island, as books tell us and our ancient sages, was a greater slaughter of a host made by the edge of the sword since the Angles and Saxons came up over the broad seas. Ethelstan's victory was so complete that it ended forever the possibility of reversing English unification. The coalition that had seemed so formidable dissolved in rout, its leaders either dead on the battlefield or fleeing back to their own territories. Constantine of Scotland, wounded and humiliated, agreed to accept English overlordship, while the Viking threat to England from Ireland was permanently broken. The England that emerged from Brunanburh was not just unified, but confident in its unity. The royal court at Winchester rivaled any in Europe for its magnificence and learning. English missionaries were once again carrying the gospel to continental Europe,
while English scholars contributed to the intellectual renaissance that was transforming European civilization. The wool trade that would eventually make England one of Europe's wealthiest nations was already beginning to develop, linking English producers with Flemish manufacturers in networks that would endure for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, the military and administrative systems that had evolved during the Reconquest had created a governmental structure capable of ruling a large, diverse kingdom effectively. The sheriffs who administered the shires, the reeves who managed royal estates, the justices who heard legal cases, all represented innovations in medieval governments that would eventually spread throughout Europe. The reign of Edgar the Peaceful, which began in 959 AD, represented the culmination of the unification process that Alfred had begun and his successors had completed. Edgar's coronation at Bath in 973 AD was attended by representatives from across the British Isles, including kings and princes who acknowledged his supremacy. The ceremony itself was carefully designed to emphasize the sacred nature of kingship and the divine sanction for English rule. The administrative system that reached maturity during Edgar's reign was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The kingdom was divided into shires, each governed by a sheriff who answered directly to the king. Local courts handled minor disputes and crimes, while major cases were referred to the royal court. A system of writs, written commands issued under the royal seal, allowed the king to communicate his will throughout the kingdom with unprecedented efficiency.
The economic prosperity of late Anglo-Saxon England was reflected in the growth of towns and the expansion of trade networks. London had become one of Northern Europe's major commercial centers, its merchants trading with partners from Ireland to Russia. The silver pennies minted in royal workshops were accepted as currency from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, testimony to England's economic strength and political stability. The cultural achievements of this period reflected the confidence and sophistication that unity had brought. The benedictional of St. Athelwold, with its glorious illuminations, represented the height of Anglo-Saxon artistic achievement. The historical chronicles maintained in monasteries throughout the kingdom provided a continuous record of English achievement that would inspire future generations. The legal codes promulgated by Edgar and his successors created a framework of justice that protected both noble and commoner. Yet, beneath this apparent success, tensions were building that would ultimately test whether the unified kingdom could survive the transition to new leadership. The very success of English integration had created new vulnerabilities, making the kingdom a tempting target for ambitious neighbors who saw opportunity in England's wealth and strategic position. As Edgar's reign drew to its close and questions about the succession began to multiply, the stage was being set for the next great crisis in English history. The Danish kings, heirs to the Viking tradition, but now rulers of a unified and powerful state, had begun to cast covetous eyes across the North Sea. The crisis that would follow would test whether the institutions that had unified England were strong enough to preserve that unity when faced with the greatest external threat since the original Viking invasions. But for now, as sleep draws you deeper into peaceful rest, let us pause at this moment of triumph, when England had first achieved true unity, when its borders were secure and its future seemed bright with promise. The challenges ahead would test this achievement to its very foundations, but they would also reveal strengths that even the builders of united England had not fully understood.
The Duke who would reshape England forever was born into a world where violence and ambition were the twin pillars of political survival. William the Bastard, as he was known in his youth, had clawed his way to power through a childhood marked by assassination attempts, rebellious nobles, and the constant threat of neighboring lords who saw opportunity in his illegitimate birth. By the time he reached manhood in the 1040s, he had transformed the fractured Duchy of Normandy into one of the most formidable military powers in Western Europe. The Normans themselves were a remarkable fusion of Viking energy and Frankish sophistication that had evolved over barely a century and a half since Rollo the Viking had first settled in northwestern France. Unlike their kinsmen who had conquered England under Canute, the Normans had embraced the feudal system with extraordinary enthusiasm, creating a society where military service, land tenure, and personal loyalty were bound together in an intricate web of obligation and reward that produced warriors unlike any the world had yet seen. Norman knights fought on horseback with a devastating effectiveness that had revolutionized European warfare. Their long lances, kite-shaped shields, and heavy mail hauberks made them virtually unstoppable in open battle when properly deployed. But more than their equipment, it was their discipline and tactical sophistication that set them apart from other medieval warriors. They could charge in perfect formation, wheel and regroup, feign retreat to draw enemies into ambush, and coordinate infantry and cavalry in ways that earlier armies had never imagined possible. The Norman Church, too, was a force to be reckoned with in ways that would prove crucial to William's future success. The duchy's monasteries had become centers of learning and reform, attracting scholars from across Europe who brought new ideas about ecclesiastical organization and papal authority. Norman abbots and bishops were not merely spiritual leaders, but political advisors, military commanders, and cultural patrons who shaped every aspect of society, while maintaining close ties with Rome that made Normandy a stronghold of church reform. When Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066, the succession crisis that erupted would draw the Normans into English affairs with consequences that neither kingdom could have anticipated. The England that faced this crisis was a realm profoundly transformed by decades of foreign influence and internal change, where the great earls who had risen to power under earlier kings had become virtually independent rulers, controlling vast territories and commanding personal armies that rivaled the king's own forces.
Earl Godwin of Wessex and his sons, particularly the formidable Harold Godwinson, had accumulated such power that they could make or break kings at will. The question of succession had haunted Edward's reign from its beginning, as his apparent preference for celibacy had led many to conclude that the royal line would die with him. Various candidates had emerged over the years, each with their own claims and supporters, each representing different visions of England's future. Edgar the Atheling, great-nephew of Edward, possessed the strongest hereditary claim, but was still a youth with no independent power base. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, had demonstrated his military and administrative capabilities, but lacked royal blood. Most intriguingly, William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the succession during a visit to Normandy in the 1050s, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support this claim during a mysterious visit to the Norman court in 1064. The exact circumstances of Harold's visit to Normandy remain one of history's great mysteries, clouded by conflicting accounts and partisan interpretation. Norman sources insist that Harold pledged his support to William's claim on sacred relics, making his subsequent acceptance of the English crown not just political opportunism, but sacred perjury. English sources suggest that Harold was shipwrecked on the Norman coast and compelled to swear an oath under duress that he never intended to honor. The drama that unfolded in 1066 would become one of the most famous succession crises in European history, a year when 3 kings would claim the English throne, and 2 would die in the attempt to make good their claims. When the Witan, the assembly of English nobles, chose Harold Godwinson as king, they set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in the most decisive battle in English history and the most successful invasion since the Roman conquest 1,000 years earlier. But the challenge to Harold's reign would come not from one direction, but from 3, as ambitious rulers across northern Europe saw opportunity in England's moment of apparent weakness. The first threat materialized in the north, where Harold's own brother, Tostig, had allied himself with Harald Haraldrada, the legendary king of Norway, whose reputation for ferocity had been earned through decades of warfare from the Byzantine Empire to the frozen wastes of Scandinavia. Haraldrada was perhaps the most feared warrior in Europe, a giant of a man who had served as captain of the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard and had fought battles from the Holy Land to the Arctic Ocean. His claim to the English throne was tenuous at best, based on agreements made between earlier Norwegian and Danish kings. But his reputation for invincibility made him a formidable opponent whose very name could inspire terror in his enemies.
The Norwegian invasion began in September 66, when Hardrada's fleet of 300 ships appeared in the Humber estuary, like a vision from the darkest Norse sagas. The force that landed was enormous by medieval standards, perhaps 15,000 battle-hardened warriors who had come not just to raid, but to conquer. Men who had followed their king across half the known world, and who expected to carve out new kingdoms with their swords. Their initial success was devastating. At the Battle of Fulford, they crushed the forces of the northern earls, killing Earl Waltheof and capturing much of the Yorkshire nobility. For a brief moment, it seemed that the age of Viking conquest might return, that England might once again fall to Scandinavian arms, as it had under Sweyn and Canute half a century earlier. Harold Godwinson's response demonstrated the administrative and military capabilities that had made him the most powerful man in England before his accession to the throne. Within days of receiving news of the invasion, he had assembled an army and was marching north at a pace that astonished contemporaries. The speed of his movement caught the Norwegians completely off guard, as they had expected weeks or even months to consolidate their position before facing serious opposition. When the English army appeared at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, Hardrada's forces were scattered across the countryside, many without their armor, believing themselves safe from immediate attack. The battle that followed became the stuff of legend, immortalized in both English chronicles and Norse sagas as one of the bloodiest encounters of the medieval period. The Norwegian king, caught unprepared, but facing defeat with the courage expected of a Viking warrior, fought with desperate valor while trying to rally his men for a final stand. According to the sagas, he fell to an English arrow while leading a charge, his death marking not just the end of a life, but the end of an age. The slaughter was so complete that only 24 of the original 300 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The Battle of Stamford Bridge represented more than a military victory. It was the final defeat of Viking ambitions to conquer England, the end of 3 centuries of Scandinavian pressure on English independence.
But Harold's triumph contained the seeds of his own destruction, as the forced march north and the bitter fighting had exhausted his army at the very moment when his greatest challenge was materializing across the English Channel. While Harold was celebrating his victory in Yorkshire, Norman ships were gathering in the harbors of Normandy, and Norman knights were sharpening their swords for the invasion that would change everything. William's preparations for the conquest of England had been meticulous and ruthless, involving months of diplomatic preparation, logistical planning, and military organization on a scale that dwarfed anything previously attempted in medieval Europe.
His army was not merely Norman, but included knights and infantry from across northern France, all united by the promise of English lands and English gold. The papal banner that flew above William's ships was perhaps his most valuable asset, as Pope Alexander II had declared Harold a usurper and a perjurer, making the Norman invasion not just a political conquest, but a holy war blessed by the highest authority in Christendom. The Norman fleet that set sail from Saint-Valery-sur-Somme on September 27, 1966, was a marvel of medieval logistics and seamanship. Nearly 700 ships carried not just warriors, but the horses, weapons, and supplies needed for a sustained campaign, while the crossing itself was accomplished with a precision that brought the entire force safely to the south coast of England near Pevensey. William's choice of landing site was strategically brilliant, demonstrating his understanding of both English politics and Harold's personal psychology. The south coast of England was Harold's own earldom, the heartland of his power and the source of his wealth. By landing there, William was not just invading England, but personally challenging Harold on his own territory, forcing the English king to abandon his victory celebrations in the north and race south to defend his patrimony. The 2 weeks that followed the Norman landing were a deadly game of strategy and maneuver that would determine the fate of England. Harold, despite the exhaustion of his northern campaign, moved with characteristic speed, gathering forces as he marched south, while trying to repeat the tactics that had succeeded so brilliantly at Stamford Bridge: surprise the enemy with rapid movement, force them to fight on unfavorable terms, and crush them before they could consolidate their position.
William's army represented the cutting edge of European military innovation. His heavy cavalry, trained to fight as coordinated units, possessed mobility and striking power that infantry formations could rarely match. His archers, drawn from across northern France, could rain death from distances that English weapons could not reach. Most importantly, his forces were trained to fight as a combined arms team, with cavalry, infantry, and archers working together in ways that multiplied their individual effectiveness. The battle itself was a masterpiece of medieval warfare, a clash of civilizations that would be remembered and studied for centuries to come. The Norman cavalry charged again and again against the English shield wall, seeking to break through by sheer force and determination, while the English held their ground with stubborn courage, their axes cutting down horses and riders with devastating effect. For hours the outcome hung in the balance, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The turning point came late in the day when rumors spread through the Norman ranks that William had been killed, causing panic that nearly broke the Norman army entirely. But William's dramatic appearance, helmet raised to show his face, rallied his men for one final desperate effort. The feigned retreat that followed was a masterpiece of tactical deception, drawing sections of the English line forward where they could be surrounded and destroyed by Norman cavalry.
Harold's death, struck down by Norman arrows and swords while defending his banner, marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of a new chapter in English history. The king who had seemed invincible just 3 weeks earlier lay dead on the field where he had chosen to make his final stand, surrounded by the flower of English nobility whose blood soaked into the Sussex soil that would become the foundation of Norman rule. The psychological impact of Hastings was as important as its military consequences, demonstrating to all who witnessed it that the age of English independence had ended, and that a new order was about to be born from the ashes of the old.
The march to London that followed Hastings was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that revealed William's understanding that conquest required more than military victory. Rather than advancing directly on the capital, the Norman Duke swept through the southern counties in a deliberate campaign of devastation, systematically destroying everything in his path, while demonstrating to the English people that resistance would be met with utter annihilation. Town after town submitted without a fight as news of the destruction spread, their leaders recognizing that the old order was dead and that survival required accommodation with these new realities of Norman power. The smoking ruins that marked William's passage spoke more eloquently than any herald could about the price of defiance, while the wealth that his army accumulated through systematic plunder provided the resources necessary to reward his followers and secure their continued loyalty. The coronation of William as King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, was both a triumph and a beginning, a ceremony that symbolized the fusion of Norman ambition with English tradition, while simultaneously revealing the challenges that lay ahead. The service at Westminster Abbey, conducted by English bishops in the presence of Norman nobles, demonstrated William's understanding that lasting rule required the sanction of both divine authority and existing institutions. Yet even as the crown was placed upon William's head, the sounds of rioting could be heard in the streets outside, a reminder that conquest was only the first step in the long process of creating a unified realm. The England that William had won was not the stable kingdom that his successors would inherit, but a collection of regions held together by little more than the immediate terror of Norman arms. The great earls who had submitted after Hastings retained control of their territories, waiting for any sign of weakness that might allow them to reassert their independence. The common people, while not actively rebellious, viewed their new masters with suspicion and fear that could easily transform into open hostility. Most dangerously, the English Church, despite its formal submission, maintained its own traditions and loyalties that would prove difficult to reshape according to Norman expectations. The earls who had bent the knee to William now raised their banners in defiance, calling upon the English people to cast off the Norman yoke and restore the ancient liberties that conquest had seemingly destroyed. In the north, Edgar the Atheling emerged from exile to claim the throne that many still considered rightfully his, while Welsh and Scottish forces prepared to support any uprising that might weaken Norman power. These revolts were not mere expressions of wounded pride or nostalgic longing for the past, but carefully coordinated attempts to exploit what appeared to be fatal weaknesses in Norman rule. The rebels understood that William's power depended entirely on his ability to maintain control of a relatively small force of foreign knights scattered across a hostile landscape, and that if they could isolate these garrisons and overwhelm them piecemeal, they might succeed in driving the invaders back across the Channel.
William's response to this crisis revealed the qualities that had made him master of Normandy despite his bastard birth and the constant challenges to his authority. He returned to England with characteristic speed, bringing fresh troops and a determination that bordered on the fanatical. But this time, his approach was fundamentally different from the calculated mercy he had shown after Hastings. The magnanimous victor, who had spared English lives and property, was replaced by a ruler who understood that mercy could be interpreted as weakness, and that lasting peace might require temporary terror. The campaign that followed was unlike anything England had experienced since the Danish invasions of the 9th century, a systematic exercise in destruction, designed not just to defeat armies, but to break the will to resist. William's forces moved through the rebellious regions with methodical brutality, not merely defeating forces in battle, but destroying the very foundations of resistance. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and populations dispersed. The Norman knights, trained from childhood in the arts of war, proved equally skilled in the grim business of pacification, leaving behind landscapes so devastated that chroniclers would write of regions where no smoke rose from any hearth for decades to come.
The psychological impact of this campaign extended far beyond Yorkshire, as word of the devastation spread throughout England, carried by refugees whose hollow eyes and gaunt faces testified to the price of resistance. The message was unmistakable. William was not merely another foreign conqueror who could be waited out or gradually absorbed, but a ruler who would rather govern a desert than tolerate defiance. The great rebellions that had threatened to overturn the Norman conquest died not in glorious battle, but in the cold calculation of nobles who recognized that further resistance would bring only annihilation. The English aristocracy that had survived Hastings and the subsequent campaigns found themselves faced with a choice between accommodation and extinction, a decision that would reshape English society for centuries to come. Yet even as he demonstrated his capacity for ruthless suppression, William was simultaneously laying the foundations for a new kind of government that would transform England more profoundly than any previous invasion. The feudal system that he imposed was not merely a method of military organization, but a complete reimagining of how power, land, and loyalty should be distributed throughout the kingdom. Every acre of English soil was now held directly or indirectly from the king, creating a pyramid of obligation that extended from the humblest peasant to the greatest earl. This was not simply a change in ownership, but a fundamental alteration in the very concept of land tenure, replacing the complex web of Anglo-Saxon rights and obligations with a system based on military service and personal loyalty to the crown. The Domesday Book, that extraordinary survey of English wealth and resources commissioned by William in 1085, reveals the scope of this transformation. For the first time in European history, a medieval kingdom was subjected to systematic accounting that recorded not just the ownership of land, but its value, its population, its productive capacity, and its obligations to the crown. The surveyors who traveled from manor to manor asking their relentless questions about livestock and plow land, about mills and fish ponds, about the number of villagers and the extent of forests, were creating more than a tax assessment. They were mapping the sinews of a new kind of state, one that could extract resources from its subjects with unprecedented efficiency,
while maintaining detailed records of its own capabilities.
Their castles, rising like stone mountains from the English landscape, were not merely fortresses, but centers of administration, symbols of a new order that combined military dominance with bureaucratic efficiency. The castle building that transformed the English skyline during the decades following Hastings represented more than military necessity. These structures were physical manifestations of Norman political theory. From simple motte and bailey fortifications that could be erected in weeks, to the massive stone keeps that required years to complete, these castles dominated the surrounding countryside not just militarily, but psychologically. They were constant reminders that power had passed into foreign hands, and that the old ways of resistance were futile against this new reality of organized domination. The White Tower of London, begun by William himself in the years following his coronation, epitomized this new architectural language of power. Rising nearly 100 feet above the Thames, its massive walls constructed from imported cane stone, it was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The tower was not merely a fortress, but a royal palace, a treasury, an arsenal, and a prison, all combined into a single structure that proclaimed the permanence of Norman rule more effectively than any number of proclamations or oaths of allegiance. The church, too, was transformed by the Norman conquest in ways that extended far beyond changes in personnel. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc of Bec, was a scholar and administrator whose vision of ecclesiastical reform would reshape English Christianity for centuries. Under his guidance, the English Church was brought into closer alignment with continental practices. Its monasteries reformed according to the latest European models. Its cathedral schools expanded to educate a new generation of clergy trained in both theology and administration. The architectural revolution that accompanied these ecclesiastical changes was no less dramatic than the military transformation of the landscape. The small wooden churches that had served Anglo-Saxon communities were replaced by massive stone cathedrals that rivaled any in Europe. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, pioneered architectural techniques that would influence building throughout the medieval world, its ribbed vaults and pointed arches creating interior spaces that seemed to lift the soul toward heaven, while demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of their Norman patrons. But perhaps the most profound change brought by the Norman conquest was linguistic. The French-speaking aristocracy that now governed England created a trilingual society, where Latin remained the language of learning and administration, English survived as the tongue of the common people, and Norman French became the language of power and culture. This linguistic complexity would endure for centuries, gradually producing the hybrid language that would become modern English, enriched by French vocabulary but retaining its Germanic grammatical structure.
The literature that emerged from this multilingual environment reflected the cultural fusion that was slowly transforming English society. The Chanson des Gestes, those heroic poems celebrating the deeds of Charlemagne and his knights, found new audiences in English halls where Norman nobles sought entertainment that reflected their own martial values. Meanwhile, English literary traditions survived and evolved, as seen in works like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which continued to be maintained by English monks who recorded the deeds of their foreign rulers with grudging respect and occasional defiance. The legal system that William imposed represented perhaps the most systematic transformation of English institutions. The old Anglo-Saxon system of local courts and customary law was gradually replaced by a more centralized system based on royal authority and written procedure. The king's justices, traveling throughout the realm to hear cases and enforce royal law, created a common legal tradition that transcended local customs and regional variations, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the common law system that would spread throughout the English-speaking world. As William's reign drew to its close in 1087, the England he left behind was fundamentally different from the kingdom he had conquered 21 years earlier. The institutions he had created, the social relationships he had established, the cultural syntheses he had fostered, all would endure long after his death, providing the foundation for developments that would eventually transform not just England, but much of the world. The conqueror's legacy was not merely military triumph, but the creation of a new form of medieval state that combined Norman efficiency with English resources, continental sophistication with insular traditions, creating something that was greater than the sum of its parts, and that would continue to evolve long after its creator had passed into history.
The writs that Henry's justices used to initiate legal proceedings, the juries that were impaneled to determine facts in civil cases, the appeals procedures that allowed cases to be reviewed by higher courts, all represented innovations that would gradually create a legal system more sophisticated than anything that had existed since Roman times. The principle that royal justice was available to all free men, regardless of their social status or political connections, established concepts of legal equality that would eventually challenge the very foundations of feudal society. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket, his former chancellor who had become Archbishop of Canterbury, represented more than a personal quarrel between old friends who had grown apart. It was a fundamental clash between secular and ecclesiastical authority that would define the relationship between church and state for centuries to come. The transformation of Becket from worldly administrator to saintly martyr demonstrated the continuing power of religious idealism in an age increasingly dominated by bureaucratic efficiency. The issues that divided Henry and Becket might seem technical to modern observers, questions about the jurisdiction of church courts, the punishment of criminous clerks, the right of appeal to Rome. But they reflected deeper questions about the nature of royal authority and the limits of secular power. Henry's position was essentially modern, that all subjects of the crown, regardless of their religious status, should be subject to the same laws and the same courts. Becket's counter-argument represented the medieval church's claim to exist as a separate society, with its own laws, its own courts, and its own ultimate loyalty to Rome, rather than to any earthly sovereign. The murder of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170, shocked the medieval world and transformed the ambitious archbishop into one of the most powerful saints in Christendom. The four knights who struck down the primate with their swords claimed to be acting on the king's behalf, but their deed accomplished the opposite of what Henry had intended. Instead of removing an obstacle to royal authority, they had created a martyr whose shrine would become one of the most popular pilgrimage destinations in Europe. Henry's public penance at Becket's tomb, where he submitted to scourging by the cathedral monks, demonstrated that even the most powerful medieval king was subject to spiritual authority. The barefoot monarch who knelt before the shrine of his former friend and chancellor was acknowledging limits to royal power that would influence English constitutional development for centuries. The compromise that eventually emerged from this crisis established principles that would govern church-state relations throughout the medieval period. The legal innovations of Henry's reign created foundations for constitutional development that would eventually limit royal power in ways that the king himself could never have imagined. The writs and procedures that his justices developed to handle the increasing volume of legal business established precedents that would gradually accumulate into a body of law independent of royal will. The principle that even kings were subject to law, implicit in the Becket controversy, would eventually find explicit expression in constitutional documents that would transform the nature of English government.
The Angevin Empire that Henry created through conquest, marriage, and inheritance represented the high point of medieval English power and influence. From his court at Chinon or Poitiers, the king could command resources that dwarfed those of any contemporary ruler. The wines of Gascony, the wool of England, the grain of Normandy, all contributed to a treasury that funded military campaigns, diplomatic initiatives, and architectural projects on an unprecedented scale. The troubadour culture of Aquitaine, the scholarly traditions of the Norman monasteries, the administrative expertise of the English government, all combined to create a cosmopolitan civilization that attracted scholars, artists, and adventurers from across Europe. The court of Henry and Eleanor became a center of literary and artistic innovation, where new forms of poetry, music, and narrative were being created that would influence European culture for centuries. The concept of courtly love that flourished in Eleanor's courts, the Arthurian romances that were beginning to take literary form, the chanson de geste that celebrated knightly virtues, all reflected the cultural sophistication that Angevin patronage had made possible. The troubadours who sang of love and honor in the halls of Poitiers were not merely entertainers, but cultural innovators who were creating new ways of understanding human relationships and social obligations. Yet the very extent of Henry's dominions contained the seeds of their own destruction. The king who ruled territories that stretched from the Tweed to the Pyrenees found it increasingly difficult to maintain personal control over such vast distances. The sons who were intended to inherit portions of this empire grew impatient with their father's longevity and began to plot against him with the encouragement of his enemies, particularly Philip Augustus of France, who understood that Angevin power posed an existential threat to French independence. The Great Revolt of 1173–74, when Henry's sons allied with the King of France and the King of Scotland in an attempt to partition the Angevin Empire, demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the system Henry had created. The administrative machinery he had built proved capable of functioning even when the king himself was fighting for his life in multiple theaters simultaneously, while the loyalty of the English baronage, secured through a combination of legal reform and material reward, held firm against the most serious challenge to royal authority since the Norman Conquest. The victory that Henry achieved over his rebellious sons and their allies was complete but Pyrrhic. The king who had begun his reign as the most powerful ruler in Europe found himself increasingly isolated, suspicious of his own family, dependent on mercenary soldiers whose loyalty could be bought but never truly trusted. The legal system that he had created to strengthen royal authority was gradually developing its own momentum, creating precedents and procedures that would eventually constrain royal power in ways that no medieval king could have foreseen. The tragic end of Henry's reign, dying at Chinon in 1189 while pursuing a futile war against his own son Richard, reflected the fundamental contradictions inherent in the Angevin system. The empire that had seemed so magnificent at its height proved impossible to hold together when personal relationships broke down
and family loyalty gave way to political ambition. The king who had transformed medieval government through his legal and administrative innovations died abandoned by those he had loved most, a victim of the very forces he had sought to control.
The legacy that Henry II left to his successors was profoundly ambiguous. On one hand, he had created institutions, legal, administrative, and governmental, that would endure long after the Angevin Empire had collapsed. The common law system, the professional bureaucracy, the concept of royal justice available to all subjects, all would survive the political fragmentation that followed his death. On the other hand, he had also created expectations and obligations that would prove impossible for his successors to fulfill, leading to conflicts and crises that would ultimately transform the nature of English kingship in ways that Henry himself would never have approved. As sleep draws you deeper into peaceful rest, let us pause at this moment when medieval England reached its greatest extent and sophistication, when English law and English administration were being forged in forms that would eventually spread across the globe. The challenges that lay ahead would test these achievements to their very foundations, but they would also reveal strengths and possibilities that even Henry II, for all his vision and energy, had not fully understood.
The young prince who would become Henry II inherited not just a crown, but a collection of territories that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, creating an empire more vast and complex than anything Europe had seen since the days of Charlemagne. Henry Plantagenet came to the English throne in 1154 with advantages that no previous king had enjoyed: vast continental domains, immense wealth, and a political vision that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of medieval kingship. The Angevin inheritance that Henry brought to England transformed the very nature of English government and English identity. No longer could English kings think of themselves as merely insular rulers, governing a kingdom bounded by the sea. They were now continental emperors, whose responsibilities extended across linguistic, cultural, and political boundaries that required new forms of administration and new concepts of royal authority. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine had added the wealth and cultural sophistication of southern France to his already impressive domains. Eleanor was not merely a territorial prize, but one of the most remarkable women of the medieval period, a patron of troubadour culture, a political actor in her own right, and a force that would shape the character of the Angevin court for decades to come. The wedding of Henry and Eleanor represented more than a dynastic alliance. It was the fusion of Northern European efficiency with Mediterranean sophistication that would create a cosmopolitan civilization. The court that Henry established moved constantly between his various domains, from the windswept castles of Normandy to the sun-drenched palaces of Poitou, carrying with it a mobile administration that could govern territories stretching across half of Europe. This was government by itineration on a scale never before attempted, requiring innovations in communication, record-keeping, and administrative procedure that would influence European statecraft for centuries. The restoration that Henry accomplished during the first decade of his reign was remarkable in its scope and thoroughness. The illegal castles that had sprouted during the anarchy were systematically demolished, their stones often used to build churches and bridges that would serve the common good rather than private ambition. The royal forests were restocked and their boundaries restored, providing both revenue and recreation for the crown,
while establishing royal authority over vast tracts of countryside. The coinage was reformed, eliminating the debased silver that had circulated during the Civil War, and establishing monetary standards that would remain stable for centuries. Trade networks were restored and expanded, linking English wool producers with Flemish manufacturers in commercial relationships that would eventually make England one of Europe's wealthiest nations. But Henry's greatest achievement was the expansion and systematization of royal justice that would transform England from a collection of feudal territories into a unified legal entity. The Constitutions of Clarendon, issued in 1164, established procedures for the administration of justice that would endure long after the Angevin dynasty had passed into history.
The son who inherited Henry II's vast domains in 1189 possessed none of his father's patient genius for administration, but he embodied perfectly the chivalric ideals that were reshaping European aristocratic culture. Richard the Lionheart came to the throne not as a king who would consolidate his father's achievements, but as a warrior prince whose dreams of glory belonged more to the pages of romance than to the harsh realities of medieval politics. Richard's obsession with the Holy Land and his determination to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin's armies reflected the fundamental shift that had occurred in European noble priorities since the First Crusade. The Third Crusade, which would consume the first years of Richard's reign, represented both the culmination of crusading fervor and the beginning of its decline, as the practical costs of distant warfare began to outweigh the spiritual benefits that earlier generations had found so compelling. The preparations for this great expedition revealed both the wealth that Henry II's administrative reforms had generated and the fragility of the system that had produced it. The Saladin tithe, that revolutionary tax levied on all movable property to fund the crusade, demonstrated how thoroughly the Norman administrative machine could extract resources from English society, but the resentment it generated revealed the limits of what even the most efficient medieval government could achieve without destroying the foundations of its own support. The regency arrangement that Richard established before his departure revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the political forces that his father had spent decades learning to control. By dividing authority between competing officials and creating institutional rivalries that invited conflict rather than ensuring stability, Richard set the stage for the civil wars that would erupt almost immediately after his departure for the Holy Land. The news that filtered back to England from the Crusade revealed Richard's undoubted military genius, while simultaneously exposing the futility of his grand design. The Siege of Acre, where Christian and Muslim armies faced each other in a deadly embrace that lasted for months, showcased medieval warfare at its most sophisticated and most brutal. Yet for all his tactical brilliance, Richard's crusade achieved nothing that would endure beyond his own lifetime, leaving Jerusalem in Muslim hands while draining the treasuries of Western Europe without producing any lasting strategic advantage. The capture of Richard by Leopold of Austria during his return journey transformed the absent king into a symbol of suffering that resonated throughout his domains while creating a financial crisis that would have profound constitutional consequences. The enormous ransom demanded for his release, equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the English crown, required financial innovations that traditional feudal obligations could not provide. The taxation necessary to raise Richard's ransom
could not be accomplished through customary feudal levies, but required the consent and cooperation of social groups that had never before been systematically consulted about royal policy. The assemblies that were summoned to approve these extraordinary measures, the representatives who were called to speak for their communities, the arguments that were made about the limits of royal authority and the rights of subjects, all established precedents that would be remembered when future kings sought to extract resources from their reluctant people. The England that Richard found upon his return in 1194 was subtly but significantly different from the kingdom he had left 5 years earlier. The administrative system had proven capable of functioning without royal supervision, but it had also demonstrated its capacity for abuse and corruption when not subject to direct royal oversight. The nobles who had governed in his absence had learned to exercise power independently, while the common people had discovered that their consent was sometimes necessary for royal policy to succeed. The death of Richard at the siege of Chalus in 1199, struck down by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle for reasons that remain unclear, seemed to epitomize the futility of his entire reign. The king, who had been hailed as the greatest warrior of his age, died pursuing a petty quarrel that had no bearing on the larger interests of his kingdom. His final act of forgiveness toward his killer, unable to disguise the fact that his death accomplished nothing and solved nothing. The succession of John to the English throne marked the beginning of the most controversial reign in medieval English history. The youngest son of Henry II had spent his entire life in the shadow of his more glamorous brothers, earning the nickname Lackland because his father had struggled to find suitable territories for him to govern. His reputation for treachery, established during Richard's absence on crusade, preceded him to the throne and would color every action he took as king. John's early years as king were dominated by the struggle to maintain control over the Angevin Empire against the increasingly aggressive attacks of Philip Augustus of France. The loss of Normandy in 1204 was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological blow that shattered the confidence of the Anglo-Norman nobility and forced them to choose between their English and their continental identities. The barons who had held lands on both sides of the Channel for generations found themselves compelled to abandon one set of estates or the other, creating resentments that would poison John's relationship with his nobility for the remainder of his reign. The financial crisis that resulted from the loss of Normandy's revenues forced John to explore new methods of taxation that brought him into conflict with every segment of English society.
The forest laws that he enforced with unprecedented severity, the feudal obligations that he interpreted in the most restrictive possible terms, the judicial procedures that he manipulated to extract revenue rather than dispense justice, all demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the delicate balance between royal authority and subject consent that his predecessors had maintained. The dispute between John and Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langston as Archbishop of Canterbury escalated into a conflict that would transform the relationship between church and state throughout Europe. The interdict that the Pope placed on England, forbidding the celebration of Mass and the administration of sacraments, created a spiritual crisis that affected every level of society while providing John's enemies with powerful weapons they would use to justify rebellion and resistance. The baronial opposition that emerged during the later years of John's reign was unlike any previous challenge to royal authority.
Led by men like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey, this movement combined practical grievances about taxation and legal procedure with theoretical arguments about the limits of royal power that drew upon both English custom and continental legal theory. The barons who confronted John at Runnymede in June 15, 1215, were not merely defending their own privileges, but articulating principles of government that would influence political development for centuries to come. The negotiations that produced Magna Carta were conducted not in the heat of battle, but in the careful deliberations of men who understood that they were creating precedents that would outlast their own immediate concerns. The Great Charter that John was forced to seal on June 15, 1215, represented a revolutionary moment in the history of medieval government. The 63 clauses of this document, hammered out through weeks of negotiation between the king and his barons, established principles that would eventually evolve into the constitutional foundations of English liberty. The famous clause 39, which declared that no free man could be imprisoned or dispossessed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, created a legal framework that would eventually extend protection to all subjects of the crown. The requirement that taxation receive the consent of those who would pay it, the establishment of procedures for addressing grievances against royal officials, the recognition that even kings were subject to law, all represented concepts that would eventually transform not just English government, but political thought throughout the Western world. But the immediate impact of Magna Carta was to plunge England into civil war, as Joan's repudiation of the charter within months of sealing it, supported by Pope Innocent III, who declared it invalid because it had been extracted by force, demonstrated that even the most solemn agreements could not resolve the fundamental tensions between royal authority and baronial resistance.
The barons' invitation to Louis of France to invade England and claim the throne showed how completely the political consensus that had sustained the Angevin Empire had broken down. The civil war that consumed the final years of John's reign was fought with a bitterness that reflected the collapse of the feudal bonds that had once united king and nobles in common cause. The siege of Rochester Castle, where the baronial forces held out for weeks against royal artillery, became a symbol of the determination with which both sides pursued their conflicting visions of English government. The devastation that this conflict brought to the English countryside, the foreign mercenaries who ravaged the land in service of competing claimants, the breakdown of law and order that made travel dangerous and commerce impossible, all demonstrated the terrible cost of political failure. John's death at Newark in October 1216, allegedly from dysentery, but possibly from poison, came at the moment when his cause seemed most hopeless. The king who had begun his reign as the undisputed master of territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, died controlling little more than the western counties of England, his 9-year-old son, Henry III, inheriting a desperate situation that seemed unlikely to improve. Yet the regency government that was established for the young Henry III, led by the papal legate Guala and the veteran administrator William Marshall, demonstrated remarkable skill in rebuilding royal authority from the ruins of John's reign. The reissue of Magna Carta in modified form, the negotiation of peace with the French invaders, the gradual reconciliation with the baronial opposition, all showed that the institutional foundations of English government were stronger than the personal failures of individual kings might suggest. The Battle of Lincoln in 1217, where the octogenarian William Marshall led the royal forces to victory against the baronial rebels and their French allies, marked the beginning of England's recovery from the crisis that had nearly destroyed the monarchy. The elderly knight who had served 4 kings with unwavering loyalty demonstrated that the ideals of chivalric service could still inspire extraordinary achievements while saving the Plantagenet dynasty and preserving the political innovations that would eventually transform medieval England. The minority of Henry III, which lasted until 1227, provided the breathing space necessary for English institutions to recover from the trauma of John's reign. The slow process of rebuilding royal authority, the careful restoration of diplomatic relations with continental powers, the gradual healing of the wounds that civil war had inflicted on English society, all demonstrated the resilience of the political system that the Normans had created and that the Angevins had refined. As Henry III approached his majority and prepared to assume personal control of the government, the England he inherited was profoundly different from the kingdom that his great-grandfather, Henry II, had ruled. The loss of the continental territories had forced the English nobility to identify more closely with their island home, while the financial pressures of constant warfare had created new forms of political consultation that would eventually evolve into parliamentary government. The legal innovations of the Angevin period had created a system of common law that transcended local custom, while the administrative machinery of the crown had proven capable of functioning even in the absence of effective royal leadership. The stage was set for the next great chapter in English constitutional development, as a new generation of kings and nobles would grapple with questions about the nature of royal authority, the rights of subjects, and the proper relationship between crown and community that would shape the future of English civilization.
The young prince, who came of age during the baronial wars of his father's reign, had learned lessons about kingship that would make him one of medieval Europe's most formidable rulers. Edward Longshanks, as he came to be known, inherited the throne in 1272 with a clear understanding that effective monarchy required not just the assertion of royal authority, but its systematic organization through law, administration, and military innovation. The England that Edward inherited was a kingdom transformed by decades of constitutional conflict that had established principles limiting royal power, while simultaneously demonstrating the need for strong leadership. The new king understood that his authority derived not from divine right alone, but from his ability to provide justice, security, and effective government to subjects who had learned to expect consultation in matters affecting their interests. Edward's great enterprise, the conquest of Wales, was more than a military campaign. It was an exercise in state-building that would establish patterns of governance extending far beyond the principality itself. The Welsh wars that dominated much of Edward's attention during the first decades of his reign represented the systematic reduction of the last independent Celtic kingdom within the British Isles. Prince Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, who styled himself Prince of Wales, had taken advantage of English weakness during the baronial wars to create a genuinely independent Welsh state that controlled most of the principality and maintained diplomatic relations with other European powers. The challenge that Welsh independence posed to English authority was not merely territorial, but constitutional, as it demonstrated that English claims to overlordship could be successfully resisted by determined opponents. The systematic campaign that Edward launched against Wales, beginning in 1277, showcased the military and administrative capabilities that distinguished the late 13th century English state from its predecessors. The coordination of land and sea forces, the construction of supply bases and strategic roads, the deployment of engineers and siege specialists, all demonstrated a level of organizational sophistication that earlier English armies had never achieved. The great castles that Edward built to secure his Welsh conquests, Carnarvon, Conway, Harlech,
Beaumaris were not merely fortifications, but symbols of English power, designed to overawe the Welsh people and demonstrate the permanence of their subjugation. These massive stone structures, with their concentric walls and sophisticated defensive systems, represented the cutting edge of medieval military architecture, while proclaiming to all who saw them that English rule had come to stay. The death of Llewellyn in 1282, killed in a skirmish while attempting to rally Welsh resistance, marked the end of Welsh independence and the beginning of systematic English colonization. The Statute of Wales that Edward promulgated in 1284 imposed English law and English administrative systems upon the conquered principality, while creating the institutional framework that would govern Anglo-Welsh relations for centuries to come.
The Scottish Wars that dominated the later years of Edward's reign proved far more challenging than the Welsh campaigns had been, revealing the limits of English power while establishing patterns of Anglo-Scottish conflict that would endure for generations. The death of Alexander III in 1286 and the subsequent succession crisis that brought Scotland under English suzerainty seemed to promise an easy extension of Edward's authority northward. But the Scottish nobility's resistance to English domination, symbolized by the rebellion of William Wallace and later Robert Bruce, demonstrated that conquest and governance were very different achievements. The Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where Wallace's forces destroyed an English army through tactical innovation and inspired leadership, showed that military superiority could be overcome by determination and local knowledge. Wallace himself embodied the new kind of resistance that Edward's policies had inadvertently created. Unlike the traditional Scottish nobility, who fought primarily for personal and dynastic interests, Wallace represented a form of popular nationalism that drew its strength from the common people's attachment to their independence and their ancient ways of life. The brutal execution of Wallace in 1305, hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor to a king he had never acknowledged, demonstrated Edward's determination to crush Scottish resistance through terror. But the martyrdom of the Scottish patriot achieved the opposite of what Edward intended, inspiring rather than deterring future resistance and creating a symbol of Scottish independence that would outlast the English king himself. The legal innovations of Edward's reign, embodied in the great statutes that bear his name, represented a systematic attempt to codify and rationalize the common law that had evolved during the previous 2 centuries. The Statute of Westminster, the Statute of Mortmain, the Statute of Quia Emptores, all addressed specific problems in legal procedure and property law, while creating a coherent framework of jurisprudence that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The king, who was known as the English Justinian, understood that law was not merely a tool of government, but the foundation upon which stable society rested. His legal reforms sought to balance the competing claims of crown, nobility, and common people, while establishing procedures that could resolve disputes without resorting to violence or arbitrary authority. The development of parliamentary institutions during Edward's reign reflected the practical necessities of governing a complex society, rather than any theoretical commitment to popular government. The assemblies that the king summoned to approve taxation, to hear petitions, to witness important ceremonies,
gradually evolved into a regular part of the governmental process that could not be ignored or bypassed when royal policy required popular support.
The model parliament of 1295, with its careful balance of nobles, clergy, and commons, established a template for representative government that would be copied throughout Europe. The formula that Edward used to summon this assembly, "What touches all should be approved by all," articulated principles of consent and representation that would eventually transform medieval concepts of political authority. The financial pressures that drove Edward to seek parliamentary approval for his policies revealed the fundamental changes that were transforming medieval society. The king, who had inherited a realm where royal authority was largely self-financing, found himself governing a nation where the costs of administration, warfare, and diplomacy far exceeded traditional revenues. The taxes that Parliament granted, the loans that Italian bankers provided, the commercial duties that merchants paid, all demonstrated that England was becoming integrated into a European economy that operated according to new rules and new expectations. The expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 marked the end of an era in English economic development, while simultaneously revealing the religious and social tensions that were reshaping European society. The Jewish communities that had provided essential financial services since the Norman Conquest found themselves victims of popular prejudice and royal greed, their departure forcing English merchants and landowners to develop new forms of credit and investment that would contribute to the commercial revolution of the later medieval period. The cultural achievements of Edward's reign reflected the growing sophistication of English society and its increasing integration with continental European civilization. The Gothic cathedrals that rose in cities throughout the kingdom, the illuminated manuscripts that were produced in monastic scriptoriums, the vernacular literature that was beginning to compete with Latin as a vehicle for serious expression, all demonstrated that England had become a major center of medieval culture. The legal treatises of Bracton, the historical chronicles of Matthew Paris, the architectural innovations of the master masons who built Westminster Abbey, all contributed to a cultural flowering that rivaled anything achieved in France or Germany. The university that was developing at Oxford, the schools that were being established in cathedral cities throughout the kingdom, the libraries that were being assembled in religious houses all testified to the intellectual vitality that Edwardian England had achieved. The administrative system that reached maturity during Edward's reign was remarkably sophisticated for its time, combining efficiency with accountability in ways that would influence European governmental development for centuries. The chancery that issued royal writs, the exchequer that managed royal finances, the courts that dispensed royal justice, all represented innovations in medieval statecraft that demonstrated how traditional monarchy could adapt to the changing needs of an increasingly complex society.
The death of Edward I in 1307, while leading yet another campaign against the Scots, marked the end of an age of expansion and the beginning of a period of retrenchment that would test whether the institutions he had created could survive the transition to a new generation of leaders. The king, who had been known as the Hammer of the Scots, left behind a mixed legacy of achievement and frustration, having created legal and administrative innovations that would endure for centuries, while failing to achieve the military objectives that had consumed so much of his energy and resources. The son who inherited Edward's throne would face challenges that would have tested even the most capable ruler. The Scottish wars that had seemed nearly won would drag on for decades.
The financial problems that parliamentary taxation had temporarily solved would return with increased severity, and the constitutional questions that had been temporarily settled would re-emerge with new urgency as England entered the most turbulent century of its medieval history. The reign of Edward II would demonstrate both the strengths and weaknesses of the governmental system that had evolved during the previous century, revealing how institutional frameworks created to support strong kingship could prove inadequate when confronted with weak leadership. While parliamentary traditions developed to limit royal authority would be tested by the need for effective government in times of crisis. As we move toward the dawn of the 14th century, the foundations of English government had been laid, the precedents established, the legal frameworks created that would eventually evolve into the constitutional monarchy that would become England's greatest contribution to world civilization. But the greatest tests of these innovations still lay ahead, waiting to be met by future generations who would inherit both the achievements and the problems of their medieval ancestors.
The young king who ascended the throne in 1307 seemed destined to undo everything his formidable father had achieved through decades of patient statecraft and military conquest. Edward II possessed neither the iron will that had conquered Wales nor the political instincts that had transformed parliamentary assemblies into instruments of royal policy. Where his father had been a warrior king who led from the front, Edward II was a man of refined tastes and intimate friendships that scandalized a nobility accustomed to the martial virtues of their class. The relationship between Edward and Piers Gaveston, the Gascon knight who had been his companion since childhood, became the defining crisis of the early years of the reign. The extraordinary honors that the king showered upon his favorite, the influence that Gaveston wielded over royal policy, the contempt that both men showed for the established nobility, all created a constitutional crisis that went far beyond personal jealousy or moral disapproval. The barons who had learned to work within the constitutional framework established by Edward I found themselves confronting a king who seemed determined to govern through personal whim rather than institutional precedent. The ordinances of 1311 imposed upon Edward much as the provisions of Oxford had been forced upon his grandfather Henry III, represented another attempt to limit royal authority through constitutional means. The tragedy of Edward II's reign lay not in his defiance of baronial demands, but in his inability to provide the leadership that the kingdom desperately needed. The Scottish wars that had seemed nearly won under his father's direction collapsed into a series of humiliating defeats that restored Scottish independence and shattered English military prestige throughout Europe. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert Bruce's forces destroyed the largest English army ever assembled, marked not just a military disaster, but a psychological trauma that would haunt English consciousness for generations. The flower of English chivalry lay dead on the Scottish field, while the king who had led them to destruction fled ignominiously back to England, his reputation for military leadership destroyed forever. The financial crisis that resulted from these military failures forced Edward to summon Parliament with unprecedented frequency, creating opportunities for the Commons to assert their authority in ways that would have been unthinkable under his predecessors. The representatives of shires and boroughs, who had once merely approved royal requests for taxation, began to present petitions, to demand redress of grievances, to insist that their consent was necessary for any significant governmental action.
The constitutional revolution
that had begun under Henry III and been channeled under Edward I, now accelerated beyond any single individual's ability to control. The principle that taxation required parliamentary consent evolved into the broader concept that Parliament must approve all major governmental actions, while the common law system that earlier kings had used to strengthen royal authority began developing its own momentum, creating precedents and procedures that would eventually constrain royal power in ways that no medieval king could have foreseen. The rise of Thomas of Lancaster as the effective ruler of England during the middle years of Edward's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of baronial government. The king's cousin, who controlled vast territories in the north and commanded the loyalty of a significant portion of the nobility, possessed the resources and authority to challenge royal power directly. Yet Lancaster's rule proved as arbitrary and ineffective as Edward's had been. The murder of Piers Gaveston in 1312, carried out by a group of earls who had grown tired of constitutional restraints, marked a turning point in English political culture. The brutal execution of the king's favorite, seized while under safe conduct and killed without trial, demonstrated that the rule of law was still fragile and that personal hatred could override institutional procedures when passions ran high enough. The trauma that this event inflicted upon Edward II transformed him from a weak but essentially harmless ruler into a man consumed by the desire for revenge. The civil war that erupted when Edward finally moved against Lancaster and his allies revealed how completely the consensus that had once united the English nobility had broken down, while the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322, where Lancaster's forces were defeated and the Earl himself captured and executed, marked the temporary triumph of royal authority achieved through methods that violated every principle of justice and due process that English law had established. The rise of Hugh Despenser the Younger as Edward's new favorite demonstrated that the king had learned nothing from the Gaveston affair. The rapacious greed with which the Despensers accumulated lands and offices, the contempt they showed for established legal procedures, the violence they employed against their enemies, all recreated the conditions that had led to the earlier crisis, while proving far more dangerous than Gaveston had ever been. The invasion of England by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer in 1326 represented more than a rebellion against an unpopular king. It was a revolutionary moment that would reshape the relationship between crown and subject for centuries to come. The queen, who had been humiliated by her husband's open preference for male favorites, together with the exiled baron who had escaped from the Tower of London to seek refuge in France, assembled a coalition that included not just disaffected nobles, but representatives of the merchant classes and the common people who had grown weary of incompetent government. The speed with which Edward II's regime collapsed revealed how completely it had lost the support of the English people. The king who had once commanded the resources of the wealthiest kingdom in Europe found himself abandoned by his own servants, pursued by his own subjects, reduced to a fugitive in his own realm before being captured at Neath Abbey in November 1326. The deposition of Edward II required constitutional innovations that had no precedent in English law. The parliament that was summoned to witness the king's abdication included not just the traditional estates of nobles and clergy, but representatives from every level of society, creating an assembly that could claim to speak for the entire English people while establishing procedures that would be remembered when future generations faced similar crises.
The murder of Edward II at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, carried out on the orders of Roger Mortimer, with the probable connivance of Queen Isabella, demonstrated that even the most elaborate constitutional procedures
could not entirely eliminate the role of violence in medieval politics. The manner of the king's death, allegedly killed by a red-hot poker thrust into his bowels, was designed to leave no external marks while inflicting maximum agony, its symbolism unmistakable in an age that understood such messages. The regency of Isabella and Mortimer, which governed England in the name of the young Edward III, quickly revealed that the removal of a tyrannical king did not automatically produce good government. The Queen Mother and her lover proved as rapacious and arbitrary as the dispensers had been, accumulating wealth and power while neglecting the administrative reforms that the kingdom desperately needed. The coup by which Edward III seized control of the government in 1330, capturing Mortimer at Nottingham Castle and sending him to the scaffold, marked the beginning of the most glorious period in medieval English history. The young king, who had been raised amid the political chaos of his father's reign and the moral corruption of his mother's regency, possessed both the military genius and the political wisdom necessary to restore English power and prestige. The claim to the French throne that Edward III advanced in 1337, based on his descent from Philip IV through his mother Isabella, provided the pretext for a conflict that would define English foreign policy for more than a century. The 100 Years' War that followed was not merely a dynastic dispute, but a struggle for control of the economic and political systems that governed Western Europe. With English wool, Flemish textiles, and French wine regions all becoming battlegrounds in a conflict that would reshape the medieval world. The great victory at Crécy in 1346, where Edward III's army destroyed the flower of French chivalry through the devastating effectiveness of massed archery, marked the beginning of English military supremacy that would endure for generations. The death of the blind King John of Bohemia, who rode into battle tied to his horse so that he could strike one blow for honor before he died, symbolized the passing of an age when individual heroism could triumph over technological innovation and tactical sophistication. The Black Death that struck England in 1348 represented a catastrophe that dwarfed any military defeat or political crisis the kingdom had yet experienced. The plague that had originated in Central Asia and spread along the trade routes of the medieval world killed perhaps a third of England's population, transforming every aspect of society in ways that would take centuries to understand fully. The social and economic disruption that followed challenged every assumption about the proper ordering of medieval society. The labor shortage that resulted from the plague's devastation gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power, leading to wage increases and social mobility that threatened the entire structure of feudal relations, while forcing innovations in agriculture, industry, and commerce that would accelerate England's transformation into a modern state.
The Statute of Labourers, passed by Parliament in 1351, represented a desperate attempt to freeze wages and social relationships at pre-plague levels. But the economic forces that the plague had unleashed proved stronger than any legislation could contain. The tensions that resulted would eventually explode into the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, demonstrating that the medieval social order had been permanently destabilized by demographic catastrophe. The renewal of the French War in the 1350s provided Edward III with opportunities to demonstrate that English military superiority had survived the plague's devastation.
The Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the Black Prince's forces captured King John II of France and decimated the French nobility, confirmed that the tactical innovations pioneered at Crécy could be repeated with devastating effect, while providing England with resources that funded further military campaigns and magnificent cultural projects. The Good Parliament of 1376, which met in the final years of Edward III's reign, demonstrated how completely the political balance had shifted since the beginning of the century. The Commons, emboldened by their role in financing the French wars, began to assert their authority in ways that would have been unthinkable under earlier kings, impeaching corrupt officials, demanding regular accounting of royal expenditures, and insisting that taxation required genuine parliamentary consent. The death of the Black Prince in 1376 and of Edward III himself in 1377 marked the end of an age of military glory and the beginning of a period of internal conflict that would test whether the institutions created during the previous century could survive the transition to a new generation of leaders. The child who inherited the throne as Richard II would face challenges that would have tested even the most experienced ruler, while the nobles who surrounded him would discover that the lessons of the past provided imperfect guidance for the problems of the future. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which erupted during the early years of Richard II's reign, represented the culmination of social tensions that had been building since the Black Death. The poll tax that triggered the uprising was merely the final provocation that broke the patience of a peasantry that had endured decades of oppression and exploitation, while watching their social superiors profit from the very disasters that had destroyed traditional rural life. The rebels who marched on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler and John Ball articulated demands that went beyond tax relief, calling for the abolition of serfdom, the redistribution of church wealth, and the establishment of a more egalitarian society that would recognize the fundamental dignity of all who labored for their daily bread. The dramatic confrontation at Smithfield, where the young Richard II faced the rebel leaders in person, demonstrated both the courage and the cunning that would characterize his reign. The king's promise to grant the rebels' demands, his apparent sympathy for their grievances, his willingness to risk his own safety to prevent further violence, all created a legend of royal compassion that would inspire future generations, while revealing the continuing power of monarchical charisma in an age of institutional government.
Yet the brutal suppression of the revolt that followed, the execution of its leaders, the restoration of the old social order, all revealed that even the most dramatic gestures of royal sympathy could not overcome the fundamental inequalities of medieval society or satisfy the aspirations for social justice that economic transformation had awakened among the common people. The reign of Richard II would evolve from this promising beginning toward a tragic conclusion that would demonstrate both the possibilities and the limitations of late medieval kingship as England entered the final phase of its medieval development and prepared for the constitutional innovations that would eventually transform the relationship between crown and subject in ways that would influence political development throughout the modern world. As our journey through the mists of medieval time draws to its gentle close, we can see how each thread of this great tapestry has been woven together across nearly 1,000 years of English history to create a civilization that would eventually spread its influence across the globe. The story we have traced together, from the withdrawal of Roman legions to the dawn of the Tudor age, represents more than a chronicle of kings and battles, more than a record of conquest and construction. It is the epic of how human beings, faced with the eternal challenges of creating order from chaos, justice from oppression, and hope from despair,
gradually built institutions and traditions that would outlast any individual life and influence generations yet unborn. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged from the ruins of Roman Britain, with their wooden halls and warrior poets, their conversion to Christianity, and their flowering of learning, established the foundation stones upon which everything that followed would rest. When we think of Alfred the Great hiding in the Somerset marshes, reduced to a fugitive in his own kingdom, yet never abandoning his vision of what England might become, we see reflected the indomitable human spirit that refuses to surrender even in the darkest hours. The legal codes he promulgated, the schools he established, the chronicles he commissioned, all demonstrated that true leadership lies not in the exercise of power alone, but in the creation of institutions that will serve the common good long after their creators have passed into memory. The Norman conquest that followed represented not just a change of dynasty, but a fusion of cultures that would create something entirely new under the sun. When William the Conqueror imposed his feudal system upon English soil, when his architects raised their stone castles and Gothic cathedrals, when his administrators created the records and procedures that would govern a complex society, they were building bridges between the Germanic traditions of early England and the sophisticated civilization of continental Europe.
The Doomsday Book, with its meticulous recording of every village and farm, every mill and fish pond, tells us that medieval government could achieve levels of organization and efficiency that would not be equaled for centuries. But more than administrative competence, the Norman period demonstrated how different peoples could learn from one another, how conquest could become synthesis, how the best elements of competing traditions could be preserved and combined to create something greater than either could achieve alone. The Angevin Empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees showed medieval England at the height of its power and influence, when English kings ruled vast continental domains and English scholars taught in the universities of Europe. Henry II's legal reforms created the common law system that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world, establishing principles of justice and procedure that recognized the fundamental equality of all subjects before the law. Yet the very success of the Angevin achievement contained the seeds of its own destruction, as the practical impossibility of governing such vast territories revealed the limitations of medieval monarchy and the need for new forms of political organization that could function without constant royal supervision. The constitutional crises that followed, from Magna Carta through the baronial wars to the development of Parliament, represented humanity's gradual discovery that government required not just effective leadership, but the consent of the governed. When the barons confronted King John at Runnymede in 1215, when they forced him to accept that even kings were subject to law, they were articulating principles that would eventually transform political thought throughout the Western world. The Great Charter that emerged from those negotiations was more than a feudal document protecting aristocratic privileges. It was a recognition that power must be exercised according to established procedures, that authority derived its legitimacy from its service to the common good, and that subjects possessed rights that no ruler could arbitrarily violate. The Parliament that evolved during the 13th and 14th centuries represented humanity's first successful attempt to create representative institutions that could give voice to the aspirations and concerns of ordinary people. When the Commons first gathered in Westminster Hall, when they began to assert their authority over taxation and legislation, when they learned to use their collective power to hold kings and ministers accountable for their actions,
They were creating precedents that would eventually democratize government throughout much of the world.
The cultural achievements of medieval England, from the illuminated manuscripts of Lindisfarne to the poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer, from the soaring architecture of the great cathedrals to the legal treatises that codified English jurisprudence, all testified to a civilization that valued learning, creativity, and the pursuit of truth alongside the more practical necessities of government and defense. When we read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, with their vivid portraits of English life, from the knight to the plowman, we encounter a society that recognized the dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their social station. When we contemplate the architectural marvel of Westminster Abbey or Durham Cathedral, we see humanity reaching toward the divine while creating beauty that would inspire countless future generations. The plague and social upheaval that marked the 14th century tested every institution that medieval England had created, yet also revealed their essential strength and adaptability. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 demonstrated that ordinary people had learned to articulate their demands for social justice in terms that drew upon the very legal and constitutional traditions that their social superiors had created, proving that the principles of English liberty could not be permanently confined to any single social class. The Wars of the Roses that brought the medieval period to its violent conclusion showed both the price of political failure and the resilience of English institutions. Even in the midst of civil war, when royal authority collapsed and noble factions fought for control of the crown, the common law continued to function in local courts, Parliament continued to meet and deliberate, and the fundamental structures of English government survived to be inherited and strengthened by the Tudor monarchs who would follow. As you drift deeper into peaceful sleep, remember that the medieval world was not a distant realm of romantic fantasy, but the foundation upon which our modern civilization rests. The freedoms we enjoy today, the legal protections that safeguard our rights, the democratic institutions that give us voice in our own government, all trace their origins back to those misty centuries when England was young and the future was being written in the deeds of extraordinary men and women. The Parliament that began as a feudal assembly has evolved into the mother of democratic institutions worldwide. The common law that emerged from medieval English courts has spread to every continent, carrying with it principles of justice and due process that protect the innocent and constrain the powerful. The English language that absorbed influences from Latin, French, and Germanic sources has become the vehicle for a literature that explores every aspect of human experience, and a medium of international communication that links peoples across all boundaries of nation, race, and culture.
In the struggles and triumphs of medieval England, in the gradual creation of institutions that balanced authority with accountability, power with responsibility, tradition with innovation, we can see reflected our own eternal human quest to create societies that serve human dignity and promote human flourishing. The knights and peasants, the kings and scholars, the saints and sinners who peopled medieval England were not fundamentally different from ourselves. They faced the same basic challenges of creating meaning from existence, order from chaos, and hope from uncertainty that every generation must confront anew. Their legacy to us is not a perfect world, but something far more valuable.
The knowledge that human beings can achieve extraordinary things when they are united by common purpose and sustained by unshakable faith in the possibility of progress. The institutions they created were not flawless, but they were perfectible, capable of growth and adaptation as human understanding deepened and human aspirations expanded. The medieval age had ended, but its spirit lives on in every courtroom where justice is sought, every parliament where representatives deliberate, every school where knowledge is pursued, every church where souls seek meaning, and every human heart that refuses to accept that things must always remain as they are. Sleep now in peace, cradled by the knowledge that you are heir to this magnificent tradition, that the blood of those who built England flows in the veins of all who cherish liberty, that their dreams of a better world continue to inspire and guide us as we face the challenges of our own time. The mists of time may obscure the details of individual lives, but the great themes of human courage, wisdom, and perseverance that defined medieval England continue to light our way toward a future worthy of the sacrifices made by those who came before. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest gift that medieval England has given us, the understanding that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things, that justice is worth fighting for, that freedom is worth preserving, and that the human spirit, when guided by wisdom and sustained by faith, can overcome any obstacle and achieve any goal that human imagination can conceive. Rest well, and dream of the England that was, the England that is, and the England that yet may be.